Hello, everyone. Welcome to a quick special episode of If You Could Hide to Kolob podcast. My name's Daniel. This is my brother Clive.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. And yeah, as you all may or may not know, we're going to be talking about the Community of Christ because they've just announced their first female prophet.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lady by the name of Stacey Cramm was voted in as the prophet president, what they call prophet president of the church today. So she knew back in January of last year that this was going to be her calling when a guy called Steve Vasey, he was the president and he retired from the role. So then it was up to him and their quorum to pick who the new president was going to be. And in January last year, they announced that it was going to be Stacey Cramm.
You know, out of everything they do, prophet president seems to make a lot of sense. Trying to explain to my kids the prophet of the church, and they say, well, technically, you know, the apostles are prophets as well. He's the president of the prophets.
Yeah.
And so, you know, and so to say prophet president, it's like, oh, that makes so much sense. Why don't we start doing that?
I mean, it's probably I think for a Latter-day Saint, like I really enjoy studying the Community of Christ was the RLDS. Watching a conference, their World's Conference, is so different to our church. It is incredibly different. They have these things called delegates where it's almost like a political party where one person who represent your region, they go to the World Conference and they vote in. So there's a whole bunch of things that they get to vote on. All legislation, all doctrinal changes are all voted on. And so today, the head chair, she says, we're now going to vote on Stacey Cramm being the prophet president. And then literally everyone just gets to put their hand up for and against. And that based on that vote, she is now the president of the church. It's really, really different to anything that we're used to.
Is it like a majority rule sort of thing? Like, okay, I see more hands than not hands, or is it you disagree? Why don't we have a chat about it?
In doctrinal things, when they put up doctrinal things, people do get to go to the mic and they do get to talk and say why they agree or disagree. And then based on majority, they may or may not vote that in, may or may not become doctrine. But for this particular occasion, everyone in the hall got to vote, and some people voted no. The vast majority, I think that it looked to me when I was watching, there was 600 or 700 people there. I think there's probably 10 or less who voted against.
So was she an apostle first? Is that, or is it not? Doesn't not work similar to how we do it?
No, she was an apostle. She was first voted in, or she first got her leadership position in the church. She became an elder, I think, in like 87, like in the 80s. And then from there, she just progressed in the church. Like in our church, people progress through different callings. She progressed through the church and was the presiding bishop at one stage, a high priest. And then in the quorum has lots of women. It's not just her. I think it might even be almost half. But she was then voted to be the prophet president after serving in the church for 30 years at least.
Yeah, because I was reading their Doctrine and Covenants, which, I mean, they have ours, and then they've got their own.
Yeah.
So section 156 is what I was reading.
Yes.
About when they first introduced that women could have the priest, and that was 1984. So she got called in 1987. It was pretty much straight away as soon as it all came about. But it was funny, though, because I was reading it, and they were basically saying that we're calling women are going to have the priesthood because the men that have the priesthood aren't magnifying their callings.
Right.
And there was just like this list, not magnifying their callings and not doing express things that the church expected them to, and just all these things. I thought, wow, what an interesting, like, sort of, I don't know, like a conclusion. Like, okay, you men aren't doing this, so now we're going to call women to try and do it instead.
One really interesting thing about that, Clive, that the president of the church was a guy called Wallace B. Smith. And he was the one that wrote Doctrine and Covenants 156, which is when we get the priesthood. He was the last of Joseph Smith's descendants to actually be president of the church. He was the last one. So, and he gave up his presidency in 1996. So from Joseph Smith III, who was 1860 all the way to 1996, was direct descendant of Joseph Smith.
Did he know that his time was coming, and so he made this big decision? Or I guess it doesn't really work that way, does it? Like, in my mind, I always think our prophets and apostles pray, and God gives them the answer. And I guess it's wrong of me to think when they pray, they're just making it up. And I guess that's just my thought. I got to do something dramatic to make myself sound good, but that's really not the case. They still believe that they're receiving revelation.
But it's not the same. It's just not the same at all as what we do. So Wallace Smith, he just retired. So in our church,
okay.
the president is the president till they die. In almost all cases, where here they are president till they retire, and then they hand over the reins to someone else. In previous generations, it's been till death, but in all the recent times, they get to a point where they just say, "I'm retiring." And Steve Vasey, who was the old president, he wasn't even that old, but he just said, "My time's done. I'm going to step aside." And then, of course, they bring Stacey Cramm in.
Do you think this will be a huge benefit for them? Like it's only been recently where they've welcomed same-sex marriage, and they've said that that all of that sort of thing is okay, and it went both ways. Like it boosted the younger, or what I've read online anyway, it boosted the younger, and the older generation sort of fell away. Do you think this is going to boost the church?
I think it will, but the church is not the same as ours. They don't believe that they are the one true church. So the church, they want to grow followers, and they're trying to grow in a lot of countries. They hope this year they grow into, or next year they get into another sort of 10 or 15 countries. But they don't profess to be, the one true church. They call themselves the community of Christ instead of the church of Christ, because they say they're part of a community. There's lots of churches of Christ, and they're one in the community. So they're not about bringing members in. We're the only true church. Come to us, or you're not going to be saved, kind of thing. They are really big on the environment. They're huge on inclusivity, huge on the environment, and so they've got these kind of pillars. And so their new president, Stacey Cramm, will be able to bring more of that in. But she's really, really smart. She's super qualified for the job. I'm sure when I was reading about her last year, she was like an aircraft engineer in the Air Force. So she's very smart. She will be a good leader of their faith.
I agree. I think it's important to celebrate everybody out there. Just because we don't believe what they say doesn't make them irrelevant at all. How many people celebrated when the new Pope was called? It's the same sort of thing. Congratulations to anybody who's able to be called to a high calling in something that they believe in.
Okay, well, thanks for tuning in. We thought we'd jump on and give this episode a little bit of a history of the community of Christ, and maybe we'll get to do a little bit more about them as we go on this year or next year. They're really, really interesting, and it's great to learn about other religions. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you for our normal Come Follow Me lessons this week.